week with Connie and Sean and Matthew went pretty well. We're celebrating 2 years. I know that sounds weird to say celebrating, but on March 31st, Sean went into the hospital. They told us in the emergency room his oxygen was at 15%. Usually below 80 they consider fatal. So it's amazing that we have our son still. And so we are definitely celebrating, although there was a year in the hospital, now a year of rehab and more years of rehab to come as his nerves heal the way that they need to. Rick asked if there was any improvement, and the answer is yes, but it's really small stuff. And I don't even know how to describe, how little that is. I mean, it's little things with his hands and movements. And so just please keep praying with us, rejoicing with us that we have our son. And, we really look forward to, Connie being down here again at some point, that may happen. Sometimes you guys have asked about Sean coming down here. The reason he's staying up in Denver is Craig is one of the best rehab hospitals in the world, and he's getting amazing treatment there. Secondly, he doesn't want to. That counts, right? And the third thing is that we're just not set up where we could handle his wheelchair and access. He couldn't get into this building. He couldn't get into the house. So it's not possible at this point. So he's where he needs to be at this point. And your prayers been a great benefit. And we've been blessed by brothers and sisters in Christ all over the world with not just prayers, but financial help, because we lost Connie's income, we lost Sean's income, and apartments in Denver are expensive. So that's been a big thing, and we've been amazingly blessed by our brethren to help us take care of that. So I guess is that good enough update? If you have questions, feel free to ask. I will probably say I don't know. It's my favorite answer. Hebrews, the 10th chapter that we read just a little bit earlier, begins in verse 32, where he tells the Christians of that time, he says, remember the former days after you were enlightened. Enlightened is an incredibly, to me, poetic and beautiful way of talking about coming to know Christ. This letter to the Hebrews was written to those who had formerly been Jewish. They had followed after God in that way, but they had also come to know Christ, and so they chose to follow him. But now they're really struggling with their faith. And you can see that even a few verses earlier, up in verse 26, where he says, if you go on sinning deliberately, the sinning that he's talked about throughout the book of Hebrews is unbelief. And I think that's his focus. He's not talking about, generally sinning deliberately. He's talking about people who decide, I don't believe in God anymore. I don't believe that Jesus came to die for my sins anymore. I think that's what he's talking about. And that's where they were. So he's talking to them about that. He says, remember that time when you were first enlightened, when you first became Christians. And interestingly, what he mentions is that they endured a lot of struggling and hardship during that they suffered because of that. He mentions some things about being publicly exposed to affliction. They had compassion on people who were in prison, so people were being thrown in jail. It was a hard time, but they kept on. They endured through those difficult moments. And then he tells them why they endured. He says, you knew. I just want to focus on that word. You knew. They weren't guessing, right? You knew that you had a better and an abiding possession. So really what he's saying is, You were living here on earth. You were a follower of Jesus. And living on earth was really, really hard. But you kept going because there was something more. That's the something that's been promised to us by God of a heavenly home, being reconciled with Him and being together with Him. And you endured during those very difficult times. And so He encourages them in verse 34, don't throw away your confidence. I'm sorry, that's verse 35. Don't throw away your confidence. Now, to me, that fits very much with their idea of looking forward to heaven and being with God. There's a confidence there that says, I have an abiding possession. I have something more to come. And so what He encourages them to do, verse 35 says, which has great reward. So there's something good up ahead that you're looking for. So He reminds them in verse 36, you have need of endurance. I think David's translation used the word perseverance. It's a good translation. So you've got to keep going. So what He's saying to them is, it was hard before and you kept on. It's really what He's saying is, it's still hard. But you've got to keep your confidence and you've got to keep going. You've got to endure for the things that are coming. And He emphasizes, endure while you do the will of God. So keep following after the principles that have been taught to you in God's Word. Keep doing the things that He's wanting you to do and obeying what He has said. And He says, then you're going to receive what was promised. And that's where the confidence comes in, right? So the confidence is, we have confidence that God has made promises. He's going to keep those promises. There's great reward. So what do we need to do? Keep on. Keep on fighting the good fight, and all those cliches that we use to say keep on keeping on. We've got to keep doing those things. And He reminds them of a quote. He quotes from the book of Habakkuk, at least in part, about my righteous ones shall live by faith. Habakkuk was a great place to go because when Habakkuk was a prophet, he was very curious about what God was actually doing at that time because it didn't make sense to him. As a Jew living in Jerusalem, Habakkuk looked around. He saw how evil the Jews were to each other, that they were not following God's law. And Habakkuk asked the question, God, you're better than this. Why aren't you doing something? Why isn't something happening? And God said, something is going to happen, but you're not going to believe it. And Habakkuk is like, okay. And God says, I'm sending the Babylonians. And Habakkuk says, they're worse than we are. How can you allow that to happen? And he's struggling with what God both is not doing and what God is planning on doing. And God says to him at one point, my righteous one will live by faith. He's going to endure because he's not looking at just the things that are happening at that moment. So, if you look in verse 38 of that passage, you'll also notice then the contrast that is made. But if he shrinks back, my soul has no pleasure in him. So, there comes that point where if you choose, I'm not going to believe in God, I'm going to give up on the faith, I'm going to turn away from it. God says, I'm not going to have any pleasure on you. Now, understand there's an antithesis to that thought also, isn't there? And although it's not expressed in the next verse, the point is, God wants to find pleasure in you. God wants to be pleased with you. That's an amazing thing, isn't it? God's looking for reasons to be pleased with us. And that contradicts, I think, for a lot of the ideas that some people have of the God of the Bible being very angry and vengeful. And I understand, there are passages where we see that, right? Not going to deny it. God gets angry, God punishes. That's part of what Habakkuk was struggling with. But on the other hand, the majority of what we see actually about God, he wants to be pleased with his people. The whole story of the Bible is about us being reconciled back together with him after we've chosen to go away from him. He he wants to be pleased in us. So that chapter ends, and this is a bad chapter break, but that chapter ends with, but we are not of those who shrink back and are destroyed, but of those who have faith and preserve their souls. So here's the encouragement the Hebrew writer is giving, right? We're going to have faith. And in that faith, salvation, right? Now, that's where we get to chapter 11, verse 1, the verse that everyone who's grown up within most churches, we know this verse forward and backwards, right? It defines what faith is. Now, faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. The assurance of things hoped for. Depends on your translation. Let me just give you a few of those. It might say substance, it might say reality or being sure or even confidence. So the idea of this word is something that you know that which is true, substantial. Okay? So there's an assurance of those things that you hope for. What he's talking about for hoping for is the fulfillment of promises. God has given promises, he's promised rewards. You can be assured of those things happening. Second part of the definition of faith is a conviction of things not seen. If you're using like the King James, it uses evidence, which we like a lot. Other ones use the word prove or to be convinced or to be certain. This is something that we know. And that fits with the word that we saw earlier that he used. You know you have a better and abiding possession. So there's this conviction that is out there of things that are not seen, haven't happened yet, haven't been fulfilled yet. I can't help but taking a little side road here, okay? Sorry. I mean, it's not really a side road if it's in my notes, but, the common definition of faith in the world doesn't sound like what is written in this passage. Usually in the world, when we define what faith is, what people define faith is, I mean, it's in our English dictionaries this way, that faith is belief in something without proof. Or sometimes you'll hear people say, if there's proof, then you don't need faith. You'll hear things like that. But when God defines what faith is here in this passage, it's about assurance and conviction. It's not hopeful guessing. There's more to it than that. It's not something based on a lack of knowledge, but rather it's based on knowledge, isn't it? Now, it's knowledge of the one who makes the promise, but there's a knowledge there. Again, Hebrews 10 verse 34, he talked about them. You knew you had a better possession. And he talks about the conviction, the confidence. Did you see that in chapter 10 verse 35? You need to have confidence. He's not talking about foolish confidence, like when I was 13 and I told my parents I wanted a Lamborghini. It didn't happen. It was foolish that I would think that would happen, right? Still hasn't happened. I've been waiting. Actually, I got one for Christmas. It's not this big. Yeah, right? As close as it's ever going to get. There's more to faith than what the world sometimes says is about faith. I think that's really important for us. Okay, so let me make the point here really quickly that the chapter divisions and the verse divisions that we have in our Bibles were made by men. Okay? And I think that's significant because most of us have memorized the first part of that statement, but we give very little attention to the second part that we see in verse 2. For by it, that is, for by faith, the people of old received their commendation. I don't know why it is that I haven't noticed before how important that is for everything that happens in the verses that follow. Because this is what he's been talking about in the 10th chapter, and he's making this point about living by faith in this chapter. And it's not just living by faith, but it's receiving this commendation from God. I think that's the key, isn't it? We have this commendation from God. Now, the key to understanding this word here is it's the word that's used of like a witness in a court trial, or someone who's observed and confirming something that's true. So like it's a doctor looking at your x-ray and saying, yeah, that's a broken leg. They can confirm it, right? So the idea of this word of getting witness is a good report card of gaining someone's approval. This is about winning God's approval. So faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen, so that we gain God's commendation, that God is pleased with us, that we saw in chapter 10. Isn't that amazing? God is pleased with us. The Greek scholars tell me that this word is used emphatically here. So whatever the Greek is, he's really hitting this hard, which makes me feel really bad that I never noticed it, right? He's really telling us how amazing this is, that God is bearing a strong testimony or witness for us. These guys, they did it right. So if you want to, you could even use the word applaud here. That's not just me, that's the scholars. These are the people that God applauds. These are the ones he commends in this great thing. Now, we see that commendation, right? In the 10th chapter, the great, better abiding possession, the great reward, God finding pleasure in me, the saving of our souls that he talks about at the very end. We preserve our souls. So we have this incredible picture. So understand that what he's saying here is, I'm going to just sum it up this way: my faith leads to God's commendation. That's a profound thought to me. Is it to you? That this is what God is looking for, that I have faith in him. We read through the examples in the 11th chapter. We're actually going to do that, okay? We're going to go through the examples in the 11th chapter, and we're going to see this. We're told about they had faith. So the assurance of things hoped for, conviction of things not seen. We see them doing God's will, and he had emphasized that in the 10th chapter. And so we tend to put a lot of emphasis on those two aspects of what we see in the 11th chapter. So as we go through this, I want you to note the commendation in each of the examples of the people that are talked about here. Okay? So we start with Abel in verse 4 as one of the people who are talked about as faith. By faith, Abel offered to God a more acceptable sacrifice than Cain, through which he was commended as righteous, God commending him by accepting his gift. And through his faith, though he died, he still speaks. So, was Abel commended by God? Had you missed that before? That it's not just that he offered the right sacrifice. It's not just that he was righteous. But in the end, where he's telling Hebrews at this time, these Hebrew Christians, you need to endure so that you can get to this end. Abel's an example of one who did that. It wasn't very long, but he did it, right? He was commended. God commended him for that, for his faith. And that last part just really gets to me. It still speaks. It says something that he offered it by faith. The next one in the text is Enoch. We're told about Enoch that he was taken up so that he should not see death, and he was not found because God had taken him. Therefore, it says, now before he was taken, he was commended as having pleased God. Well, that kind of sums it up nicely, doesn't it? Whatever we know about Enoch, and it's not very much, he didn't die. God took him directly. That's amazing. I don't get it. But that's something special that he and Elijah both have in common. But God's pleased with him. God commends him. God approves him. God is looking at Enoch and he's saying, good job. Because of faith. Verse 6 tells us without faith, it's impossible to please him. So that equation for us, my faith leads to God commendation. If I don't have faith, I'm not going to please God. If I don't trust him and trust the things that he said, he says, for whoever would draw near to God must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who seek him. You see the two things that he emphasizes in that verse? That God really is real and that God is going to keep his promises. He rewards us. That's the faith that he wants us to have. The next one in the chapter is Noah. Warned about things that hadn't happened yet. Out of fear, he constructed, I think my translation says reverent fear, he constructs an ark for the saving of his household. He condemned the world, it says, but he became an heir of righteousness that comes by faith. Now, as far as I recall, this is the last time we're not going to see commended anymore. But is Noah commended? I mean, the word's not used there, but he became an heir of righteousness. Heir. He became a part of the family. He was adopted into that. Doesn't that speak of something that is pleasing to God? This is what we're looking at. Abraham in verse 8. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place that he was to receive as an inheritance, and he went out not knowing where he was going. By faith, he went to live in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God. So, again, we don't see the word commendation there, but do you see God's approval of what Abraham does? Look down in verse 17. It brings up Abraham again. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises was in the act of offering up his only son, of whom he had said, through Isaac shall your offspring be named. He considered that God was able even to raise him from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. Abraham tested, trusted God. He got it wrong about what God was going to do. That's not the point. He trusted God. And he had his son back. He'd already received the son of promise, and now he still has the son. He's commended by God. Verse 11, by faith Sarah herself received power to conceive, even when she was past the age, since she was considering him faithful who had promised. Where's the commendation for Sarah? And when you think of Sarah, do you think of that moment where she laughed? A lot of us do. That's almost our first thought, right? You're going to have a child. I'm 90 years old. By faith, she had that child. That's God commending. It kind of makes me sad that we do that with Sarah, because she's there as an example of what faith is about. Verse 20, by faith Isaac invoked future blessings on Jacob and Esau. The next few ones are going to be really quick, right? You see how they're looking to the future? That's about trusting God. What if God's going to keep his promises? Verse 21, by faith Jacob, when dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph, bowing in worship over the head of his staff. Again, blessing looks forward to what they're going to receive. It's about trusting in God. By faith, Joseph, at the end of his life, made mention of the exodus of the Israelites and gave directions concerning his bones. He knew the people of Israel were going to leave because God had promised that to Abraham. So he said, well, if they're going to leave in 400 years, pack up my bones and take them with you. 400 years? That's faith, right? And that's what happened. Verse 23, Moses. By faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents because they saw that the child was beautiful and they were not afraid of the king's edict. By faith, Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He considered the reproach of Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. Do you hear what he did? He considered Christ. He thought about that first. And so that's where his faith was. He chose mistreatment. It's not an accident that the writer of the Hebrew letter uses exactly this example of someone enduring even though being mistreated. And he considered greater wealth to come from following after God. Verse 29, let's see, I went too far. Verse 27. By faith he left Egypt, not being afraid of the anger of the king, for he endured as seeing him who was invisible. Again, same kind of thing. He endured in these things. By faith, he kept the Passover and sprinkled the blood so that the destroyer of the firstborn might not touch them. I love this one because I think it's one of those that's really hard to get. They killed the lamb that day. They put the blood on the doorpost, and that saves them from death. The Egyptians who didn't do that, their firstborn died. They acted in faith. How are they commended for their faith in this example? They still have their kids, right? They obeyed God. They kept their children. God kept his promise. The destroyer didn't touch the children. By faith, in verse 29, the people crossed the Red Sea as on dry land. But the Egyptians, when they attempted to do the same, were drowned. Like that one too, don't you? Right? It's not just that they crossed the Red Sea. Remember, that wasn't easy for the Israelites. It wasn't easy for any of them as they got ready to do that. But what happened when the Egyptians started to cross? They lost their lives. 31, by faith Rahab the prostitute did not perish with those who were disobedient because she had given a friendly welcome to the spies. Rahab is a great example because she wasn't an Israelite. She was one of the people who lived in Jericho, had heard about Jehovah and what he had done for the people of Israel, and she said to the spies, if you'll save me and my family. Was she commended by God? The word's not there. Yeah, she's commended by God. Not only is she commended by God in that she saved herself and her family, but she's in the lineage of Christ. It's amazing. Verse 32, he says, and what more shall I say? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, were made strong out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. All of those are very positive, powerful things, aren't they? By faith, there was this great conquering. The writer doesn't stop there, though. Verse 35, women received back their dead by resurrection. Oh, that's a change in tone, because now we're talking not just about people who were always winning, but death happened, and women received back their children. So he goes on. Some were tortured, refusing to accept release so that they might arise again to a better life. Others suffered mocking and flogging and even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, they were killed with the sword. They went about in skins of sheep and goats, destitute, afflicted, mistreated, of whom the world was not worthy, wandering about in deserts and mountains and in dens and caves of the earth. These people lived by faith. Now listen to what the last sentence says about them. And all these, though commended through their faith, did not receive what was promised. I didn't do my animations right. I'm sorry about that. You see their faith, right? All these were commended through their faith. But verse 39 is kind of puzzling, isn't it? They did not receive what was promised. But they were commended by God. Now, they didn't receive what was promised because there was something more that they were looking forward to. And that had to do with Jesus, and it has to do with us according to this passage. But here's the key. They may not have exactly received the promises while they were alive, but what did they receive? God commended them. God being pleased in them. And that's amazing. And as we look at this chapter that we call the Hall of Fame of Faith, or whatever people have done with that, I think we need to recognize that commendation by God. We need to emphasize that what happened was incredible. That in fact, my righteous one shall live by faith. And these people lived by faith with both good and bad happening. They endured. They lived by faith and they preserved their souls because God commended them. So what is he saying in the 11th chapter? We have need of endurance. That's what we see. Because when we endure, there's commendation. We need to continue to have confidence. And in our confidence, we endure and do what God has said. Because we're looking at how can I please God? I want God to be pleased with me. So I live by faith. It's really a powerful way to look at this passage, isn't it? God commends us. And I hope that's something that's so meaningful for you today, that if you're not a child of God, if you're not a Christian at this point, maybe there's something in this that will make you think. It's about something deeper than sometimes has been presented. God says, you've sinned, you've chosen to separate yourself from me. Through Jesus, you can be reconciled. Will you make that choice? That faith, reconciled to God, there's a sense in which it happens now, but we don't receive it completely until after the great judgment. But we have that incredible hope, that incredible promise. And yeah, might be a hard road. But I look forward to receiving God's commendation. Well done, good and faithful servant. If you have the desire to become his child today, if you need our prayers and help, please come forward as we stand and sing.